Ready?
Ari,
More or less. Andrea, no
regálame
falta.
unas hojas.
What?
Piece of
Regálame
paper.
unas hojas.
Sí.
You see, my Spanish is getting better.
We will start
Your Spanish?
Getting better.
the
Well,
official
it's very good.
Para tomar.
opening session.
Pensar ideas.
Dear authorities, colleagues and friends, estimados autoridades, colegas y amigos, welcome to the WISC 6th Global International Studies Conference, the International Around the World, Multiple Voices, Alternative Orders, held in Buenos Aires in cooperation with the WISC and the Pontifical Catholic University of Argentina, the host institution, Universidad de San Andrés and Flaxo Argentina. Bienvenidos a la sexta Conferencia Global de WISC sobre Estudios Internacionales, bajo el título Lo Internacional alrededor del mundo, múltiples voces, órdenes alternativos, que se celebra en Buenos Aires en cooperación con la Pontificia Universidad Católica Argentina, que obra como institución anfitriona, Universidad de San Andrés y Flaxo Argentina. After 2 years of postponement due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we are very pleased to have the UCA and WISC higher authorities, high-rank officials from the national government, in addition to representatives from the WISC Program Committee, the Universidad de San Andrés and Flaxo Argentina. The opening session will have 3 stages. The first one is the formal opening. Then we will have a roundtable discussion meeting. And finally, we will have a reception. La apertura oficial tendrá 3 etapas. Una primera etapa que es la apertura formal. En segundo lugar, una mesa redonda de discusión sobre Rusia-Ucrania. Y en tercer lugar, la recepción en las afueras del auditorio. En primer lugar, le doy la palabra al doctor Miguel Ángel Schiavone, rector de la Universidad Católica Argentina.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos, a los presentes acá en el auditorio, a aquellos que nos siguen a través del Zoom y nos están viendo a través de un cuadradito de una pantalla, que no es lo mismo el contacto humano directo, este vínculo humano directo al estar a través de un cuadradito de una pantalla. Para los que están acá presentes, argentinos, ya nos conocen, muchos de ustedes, y para los extranjeros, bueno, esta universidad cuenta con 18.000 alumnos de grado, 5.000 alumnos de posgrado, en total 23.000 alumnos, más de 60 carreras de grado, innumerables posgrados, doctorados y maestrías, ¿no? Tenemos 4 sedes, esta acá en Puerto Madero, la sede de Rosario, la sede en Mendoza y la sede de Paraná, y algunas escuelas secundarias, tanto en Capital como en Mendoza, ¿no? Son 4.000 los docentes que nos acompañan en esta tarea y por 4º año consecutivo somos la primera universidad privada de la Argentina en el ranking WISC, que todos ustedes conocen, es un ranking internacional. Es la primera, la UCA es la primera universidad privada dentro de la Argentina y la segunda en el país y está dentro del top 10 de las universidades de Latinoamérica, ¿no? Hecho este pequeño resumen y espero que disfruten de las instalaciones, las transiten, las visiten, a pesar de que el clima no es el mejor por el frío y demás, pero hoy no estuvo tan mal. Nuestros alumnos han terminado el primer cuatrimestre, están en periodos de examen, con lo cual no hay tanto bullicio ni movimiento en los pasillos, en las aulas o en la biblioteca. Así que a lo mejor la doctora Pantano y las autoridades de nuestra universidad los acompañarán para visitar las instalaciones y visitar las distintas áreas de la universidad, ¿no? Tengo entendido que este congreso se dilató en alguna medida por la pandemia, esta pandemia que hemos sufrido todos, y que afortunadamente hoy nos permite reencontrarnos acá, ¿no? El ser humano ha vencido la adversidad del virus, ¿no? Cuando se inició la pandemia, tuve la esperanza de que algunas cosas cambiaran y que el ser humano haya identificado algunas cosas y cambiara él también, ¿no? ¿Qué cosas pensé que el ser humano debería o podría haber identificado y generado un cambio, ¿no? La primera cosa que el ser humano debió haber reconocido es su insignificancia, es su vulnerabilidad. Él podía ser destruido podía llegar a la muerte a partir de un germen invisible a su vista, a sus ojos. Otro ser viviente, invisible a su vista, podía causarle la muerte. Y esto debería recapacitarnos. El ser humano se creía el todopoderoso, dueño de la tierra y de la vida y la muerte de las personas. Y de golpe se dio cuenta que era vulnerable. El otro elemento que debíamos haber reconocido es la finitud de la vida humana. El hombre que cree que es eterno, y esta no es una cualidad y un don que tenga el ser humano. El tercer elemento que pensé que deberíamos haber aprendido es la importancia del dolor y el sufrimiento del otro. Porque el dolor y el sufrimiento del otro termina siendo nuestro dolor. Nos preocupábamos por la enfermedad del otro porque la enfermedad nos podía contagiar. Y la primera pregunta que hacíamos era, ¿te enfermaste o no te enfermaste? ¿Te vacunaste o no te vacunaste? ¿Cuántas vacunas tenías? ¿Será por un sentimiento fraternal o por una sensación de temor, ¿no? La cuarta cosa que creo que deberíamos haber aprendido es el daño ecológico que hizo el ser humano, ¿no? El verdadero viralizador del mundo ha sido el ser humano, no el virus. El hombre ha tenido una conducta pandémica, ha talado árboles, ha destruido flora y fauna del planeta. Muchos seres vivientes intermedios entre las especies animales del bosque y el hombre han desaparecido, y el contacto del hombre con especies selváticas cada vez es mayor a partir de la tala de árboles, a partir de la urbanización y a partir de estas especies intermedias. Bueno, todas estas esperanzas que uno albergaba y que esperaba que el hombre sea distinta, rápidamente se diluyeron. Se diluyeron cuando empezamos a ver estas conductas, como la invasión a Ucrania, la guerra que estamos viendo, que no sabemos cuál va a ser el fin o cuál va a ser el límite, que puede haber muchas teorías académicas, pero en la realidad depende de decisiones humanas y de muchas personas que no siempre uno las pondría en la condición de humanos, ¿no? Así que realmente creo que poco hemos aprendido. ¿Qué cosas creo que nos quedaron? Nos quedó el barbijo. El barbijo sí nos quedó, y creo que nos quedó para ocultarnos, para taparnos detrás del barbijo y no mostrar nuestras debilidades, no mostrar nuestras intenciones, ¿no? La otra cosa que a lo mejor deberían analizar en estas reuniones es si realmente el mundo global está desapareciendo, este tema de la globalización, ¿no? La globalización existe desde que el planeta es redondo, existe desde Cristóbal Colón, que globalizó culturas, religiones, epidemias y demás. Lo que pasa es que la velocidad de aquella globalización no es la misma velocidad de ahora, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué es lo que estamos viendo o qué es lo que yo veo en medio de esta pandemia? El hombre se recluyó en sus cavernas, en sus primitivas cavernas, para cuidarse, para protegerse. Y esta reclusión en las cavernas también implica una reclusión de los países. Y el mundo global de intercambio, de interacción y demás, me parece que está avanzando hacia un mundo de bloques. El bloque europeo, el antiguo bloque de la Unión Soviética, el bloque americano y el bloque Indo-Pacífico, ¿no? Me parece que estamos yendo hacia esa línea, ¿no? Así que muchas cosas uno cree que deberían haber cambiado y nos deberían haber modificado en nuestras conductas y hábitos, y parece que el hombre no perdió estas conductas y hábitos. Habitualmente, después de una guerra, después de una peste, habitualmente en la historia del hombre se terminan o se concluyen a partir de una guerra, ¿no? Porque se alteran los núcleos de poder, las pestes alteran los núcleos de poder, y se resuelven a través de conflictos bélicos. Bueno, espero que en este congreso se pueda dialogar, se pueda intercambiar ideas, y yo creo que hay dos tipos de ideas, las ideas pragmáticas, las ideas operativas, que nos permiten vivir, y en algunos casos nos permiten vivir mejor. Pero además de las ideas pragmáticas y operativas, están las ideas hermosas, esas ideas hermosas que nos dan sentido a la vida, que nos motivan a la vida. Así que espero que intercambien ideas pragmáticas y operativas, pero que también intercambien ideas hermosas que hagan que el hombre y la conducta de este ser humano sea mejor en el transcurso de la historia. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias por sus cálidas palabras de bienvenida al doctor Miguel Ángel Chiavone, rector de la Universidad Católica Argentina, a quien agradecemos por su compromiso desde 2019 en el apoyo a la Conferencia Global de WISC como institución anfitriona. Seguidamente escucharemos al secretario de Asuntos Estratégicos de la Presidencia de la Nación Argentina, al doctor Gustavo Vélez, en formato online.
Sí, muy buenas tardes. ¿Me están escuchando bien? ¿Se escuchan mis palabras? ¿Se están escuchando mis palabras? Sí. Bueno, muy buenas tardes. Les agradezco muchísimo la oportunidad que me brindan a la Universidad Católica, a todas las instituciones que participan de esta iniciativa, que no puede ser más que oportuna, porque cada uno de los integrantes y de los colegas y los participantes de este debate ven que el mundo se está conmoviendo en cada una de sus raíces, de sus pilares, y que está en un momento de una turbulencia, de una tragedia también, porque toda guerra es una tragedia, y de un cambio muy profundo. Yo me querría simplemente referir a 3 cambios que percibo en este momento en la humanidad. Lo podemos comprobar, me ha tocado participar en las cumbres de los BRICS, acabo de llegar de la cumbre del G7, estuvimos en Roma en la cumbre del G20, hay un debate entre los líderes mundiales de todo signo que está atravesado por 3 tipos de cambios. El primer cambio es el cambio tecnológico, sin duda alguna manifiesta este cambio tecnológico una profundidad enorme y pone también en discusión los grandes cimientos sobre los cuales está organizada la humanidad. Tal vez el cambio tecnológico más grande lo hemos visto en la evolución de las vacunas. El mundo fue capaz tecnológicamente de dar una respuesta apropiada para atender al COVID-19 de una manera rápida, muy importante, pero esa rapidez no se tradujo en equidad. Ese cambio tecnológico asociado a las vacunas no llegó en tiempo y forma a todos los países en igual dimensión. Y vemos tragedias como las que se han producido, por ejemplo, en el África, producto de esa falta de acceso en tiempo y forma a las vacunas. Hay una respuesta incipiente a esta realidad. La Organización Mundial de Comercio acaba de, por ejemplo, avanzar en un waiver, en una suerte de moratoria en cuanto a las patentes de vacunas, que si bien ineficiente, pone, o insuficiente, pone en cuestión el tema de cómo los derechos de propiedad intelectual pueden ser bienes públicos globales cuando se trata de problemas universales, como el tema de las vacunas asociadas a la pandemia. Es decir, el primer tema entonces es el cambio tecnológico. El mundo está discutiendo un impuesto global a las grandes corporaciones digitales, de qué manera puede atender una mayor equidad impositiva, y esto no se da solamente desde la periferia, sino que también se da desde los países centrales. El segundo elemento es el cambio ecológico, el cambio climático. Aquí también advertimos una enorme cantidad de paradojas y de dificultades en este momento. Simplemente cito una de ellas: el Fondo Verde para el Clima, que debería financiar los postulados de Glasgow, los postulados del Acuerdo de París en materia climática, no pudo todavía ser, valga la redundancia, fondeado, no pudo ser completado en los aportes que los países más desarrollados iban a hacer a ese Fondo del Verde del Clima. Sin embargo, disparada la guerra, esos 100 billones de dólares fueron rápidamente destinados al gasto armamentístico. Una tragedia para la humanidad. Una humanidad o unos países centrales que no logran canalizar recursos para el cambio climático, de la noche a la mañana canalizan recursos para gastos en armamentos. Entonces ahí hay un gran desafío también de este orden o desorden mundial que requiere una reescritura. Y esto conduce con el cambio financiero también que se produce en materia de la humanidad. La pandemia lo ha disparado. El Fondo Monetario Internacional, por citar un solo ejemplo, fue capaz de emitir derechos especiales de giro, que es la moneda que le da liquidez al mundo a través del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Emitió 600 billones de dólares en derechos especiales de giro. Solamente una mínima proporción de esa emisión se destinó a los países más pobres y de renta media a través del Fondo Resiliencia y de cambio también para atender a las condiciones de pobreza que canaliza el Fondo Monetario Internacional. Es decir, una emisión importante de derechos especiales de giro esta nueva moneda o esta moneda clásica del Fondo Monetario para otorgar liquidez al mundo en una situación de pandemia, fue canalizada para el desarrollo. Una parte muy importante de esos derechos especiales de giro hoy está engrosando las reservas de los bancos centrales de los países más ricos que ciertamente no los necesitan. Cité 3 ejemplos meros: cambio tecnológico, cambio climático y el cambio financiero. ¿Qué quiero traducir con estos ejemplos que estoy mencionando en esta apertura de este encuentro, esta cumbre, este congreso de pensamiento? El mundo necesita construir un nuevo concepto de integración, un nuevo contrato social, así como fue capaz de hacerlo en la salida de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Así como los acuerdos de Bretton Woods dieron lugar a un orden financiero distinto, así como se fue capaz de impulsar un plan Marshall para la reconstrucción de Europa, así como se establecieron las cartas liminares de Naciones Unidas, el mundo necesita rediscutir las bases sobre las cuales puedan sentarse una mejor y más justa integración y una globalización de la solidaridad, como lo plantea nuestro Papa Francisco. Tenemos un elemento doctrinario muy importante para hacerlo en base a la doctrina social de la Iglesia. Laudato Si es una guía para todos nosotros, es una guía para la humanidad. Me toca advertir el gigantesco nivel de prestigio que tiene nuestro Papa Francisco en todas las cumbres mundiales, líderes de todas las condiciones religiosas, líderes de todas las condiciones políticas, ven a nuestro Papa Francisco como un punto de referencia moral, ético, valorativo, por las cuestiones que está planteando a nivel de cómo debería reorganizarse la humanidad en este momento tan importante. Y creo que esto, al inaugurar este congreso desde la Argentina, nos tiene que llenar de orgullo. Hay un Papa argentino que está planteando un horizonte de salida, hay un Papa argentino que está planteando en su condición de pastor universal una línea de trabajo que ciertamente es una oportunidad también muy interesante y muy importante para alumbrar estos debates que ustedes seguramente van a estar enriqueciendo a lo largo de estas jornadas. De mi parte no quiero abundar en más detalles, no quiero abusar con el uso de la palabra, los felicito por esta iniciativa, creo que es un momento extraordinariamente importante para recordar que nadie se salva solo, que la reconstrucción de un sentido económico más solidario es una obligación que tenemos todos nosotros y que también desde América Latina, desde la patria grande de América Latina, hay una responsabilidad y un llamado para esta agenda universal que se está planteando. No somos los principales contaminantes del mundo, tenemos las reservas de agua, de materiales raros, de bosques, de naturaleza más importantes de la humanidad. Como tal, constituimos no solamente un problema, sino un aporte de solución a los grandes problemas universales, y lo tenemos que hacer unidos en la diversidad. América Latina está mostrando cambios muy importantes, tenemos dificultades, pero también podemos ofrecer una voz de soluciones para este momento del mundo. Por ejemplo, planteando la política injusta de sobrecargos que aplica el Fondo Monetario Internacional, un mejor uso de los derechos especiales de giro, una distribución más equitativa de los préstamos en cambio climático que dan los organismos regionales de crédito, y una posibilidad muy importante para ser creativos, como decía el rector de la UCA. Es un momento de soñar, el Papa también nos convoca a soñar juntos, es un momento de plantear grandes utopías, y es un momento de recordar que siguiendo los caminos de costumbre, los resultados van a ser los de costumbre. Solamente con una creatividad audaz vamos a ser capaces de modificar este momento tan trágico que vive la humanidad. Así que los convoco modesta y humildemente a esa utopía de soñar. Les agradezco la oportunidad que me han brindado en participar en esta inauguración, y vamos a estar también muy atentos a las conclusiones de estas deliberaciones, porque desde el pensamiento creativo las cosas también pueden comenzar a cambiar. Muchísimas gracias a todas y a todos, y los saludo muy cordialmente en esta inauguración.
Now we will listen the opening remarks from Professor Dr. Pinar Biglin, President of the World International Studies Committee.
Okay. Thank you, Ariad. Mr. President, dear colleagues, dear students, I'm going to use this opportunity to say my thank yous. I have collected a lot of debts over the year, but let me also make use of this opportunity to make a couple of remarks as well. Organizing this conference has been a 3-year journey for many of us. I jumped onto the boat 2 years into the journey. So I've been president for just over a year. So let me acknowledge the leadership of previous WISC president, Günther Hellmann, who can't be with us today. He's following us from Germany, where his academic year is still continuing. Under Günther's leadership, WISC has gained this stability that allowed us to weather the storm that is the pandemic. Since assuming WISC presidency in the summer of 21, I have traveled together with the strong team that Günther built. These include WISC Executive Secretary Roberta Dominguez, who's sitting here at the front, and WISC Treasurer Karina Jędrzejowska, who's in Poland, currently following us again online, who couldn't be with us. I'm grateful to their dedication to WISC and dedication to the IR community worldwide. Speaking of IR community, as an IR scholar, international relations scholar, I'd suggest that, and it's a costly way of doing this, but I would suggest that if you want to make sense of the international, of the world, you better organize an international relations conference attended by scholars from all around the world. We organize many regional conferences, but this is one of the truly international conferences that you can attend in the world. I've been closely involved in organization of multiple national and regional IR conferences before, but nothing, I emphasize, nothing prepared me for the challenges posed by a truly worldwide international relations institutions that the World International Studies Committee is. Now, the COVID pandemic, a worldwide economic recession, and the war in Ukraine only elevated these already complex challenges to a new level. And our hybrid conference is the sum of all these experiences. Going hybrid was a choice that we together made at a time when Omicron was raging worldwide, right? And it was impossible to plan for something else. The only option available to us was going fully online. But the hybrid option was made available to us by the infrastructure of UCA and the human resources here. Right? So we're very grateful for that. And our colleagues in other parts of the world are now envious of the hybrid conference that we've been able to organize. So it's important, I think, to acknowledge that. Doing it online would have been less of a challenge. And I'm really glad that you and us, we rose to the challenge to go hybrid. It's been experimental for all of us. It brought all kinds of difficulties. We had to improvise in different ways to address these challenges, but I genuinely think it was worth the effort because it made for those of us who are able to travel to come here and experience your great city. But those who can't travel for a variety of reasons are able to fully participate in our conference, right? So this format, for all the problems and mishaps it generates, it may be a way to go for institutions such as ours, making it possible for students or colleagues who can't travel for whatever reason to participate, not only now due to COVID conditions, but only in the future as well. Okay, let me say my thank yous. And as I said, I've generated a number of debts over the years. I'd like to thank our conference organizing team. To my left are program co-chairs, Ari Kachowicz and Andrea Olsner. So let me say thank you to them. Our UCA host, Ariel Sebastian Gonzalez, supported by his colleagues, Head of Department of Political Science, Marcelo Camuso, Academic Coordinator of Department of Political Science, Diego Ferreira, Dean Liliana Pantano, Secretary of UCA, Academic Secretary of UCA, Roberto Aras, and of course, our Rector, Miguel Angel Esquiabone. Dear grateful to you for agreeing to host us at a critical moment to us 3 years ago and staying on board after 2 postponements. Thank you. We are grateful for your commitment to our conference. And of course, our final member of our team from Argentina, Melissa De Sancio, who's sitting to the extreme right of me, representing Flaxo, but also the chair of the theme section. They all deserve credit for our 3 times organized, 2 times postponed conference that we're finally able to realize. I'd also like to acknowledge our other members of our WISC conference team, Erika Rezende, Anna Vrobel, and last but not least, Isaac Delgado, who's currently taking photos, making use of them online to raise our social profile as well. All members of our conference team got more than they bargained for initially 3 years ago, and definitely rose to the occasion. Final word about our institutional hosts and sponsors. The support that we received from the government of the city of Buenos Aires, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. They've been invaluable in organizing our conference. This is in addition to the welcome that we received here at UCA and University of San Andres, and Flaxo, Argentina, of course, one of the founding members of World International Studies Committee. I wish all of you a productive conference, and also thank you for allowing me to address you in English. Other than my native Turkish, that's the only other language that I know. So thank you for your understanding. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Pilar Bilgin, for your kind words. Ahora, lamentablemente, el vicepresidente primero de la legislatura de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires, Manuel Ferreiro, se ha excusado por temas de agenda, pero de todos modos aprovechamos para extenderle el agradecimiento al gobierno de la Ciudad de Buenos Aires por el sponsoreo de esta conferencia junto a la Fundación Friedrich Ebert de Alemania. Our next speaker is the Conference Program Committee Co-Chair, Dr. Ari Kasowitz.
I don't hear much. So, buenas tardes. Lo voy a hacer bilingüe, 2 minutos y medio en español y 2 minutos y medio en inglés. En español, que es mi lengua materna, soy porteño de aquí, 4 años de preparación. Pensamos en Cancún, pensamos en Belo Horizonte, al final salió Buenos Aires, que es mi ciudad natal, y no es lo mismo que hacerlo en otro lugar. Agradecemos, porque de hecho estas palabras son en mi nombre y en nombre de Andrea Olesner, que trabajamos juntos en los últimos años. Agradecer a la UCA, agradecer al equipo, y especialmente, como dije, a 2 individuos queridos, Andrea y Isaac, que es nuestro genio tecnológico. De hecho, nosotros, pueden decir, somos los 3 chiflados o los 3 mosqueteros o el triángulo de las Bermudas. Tomo de lo que dijo el señor rector, que por un lado invocaba en cierta forma a Discépolo y Cambalache hacia dónde se va el mundo, la posibilidad de conciliar ideas pragmáticas e ideas hermosas, y tomo del secretario de la presidencia, Gustavo Beliz, 2 frases: nadie se salva solo, y en pensamiento creativo. Y ahora paso al inglés, que no es mi lengua materna, pero viviendo en Israel desde el 79 se usa seguido. A propósito, la Universidad Hebrea tenemos el mismo número de alumnos que ustedes y el mismo ranking, pero somos una universidad pública. Finally, after 3 years of planning and postponing this conference, we are happy to welcome all of you in Buenos Aires. In the next 3 days, actually, we are at the end of the first day already. About 500 scholars from the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa will interact here at UCA and via Zoom, more or less half-half, in about 140 panels. Hosted for the first time Latin America, WISC 2022 include voices from around the world proposing different ways to study, explain, understand, and make sense of the international studies in general, international relations in particular. That's the theme that we chose, paraphrasing Julio Verne, around the world, not in 80 days, just in 3 days without leaving UCA or from Zoom. The world has become a complex place, as complicated as it's fascinating, where multiple places and voices unfold simultaneously. Those voices come not only from great powers and nation states, but increasingly from non-state actors, individuals, people on the margins of world politics, silenced voices, lost in the cacophony of the last couple of years, dealing with COVID, the COVID crisis, the recent war. By the way, it's not the only war, right? We talk about Russia, Ukraine, we don't talk about Ethiopia. Consequently, international studies are more than state power and international relations in the traditional sense, with the aim of developing a dialogue between students and scholars. And we are all equal. As you can see in the program, there are no professor, doctor. We are all equal to that sense. From different latitudes and hemispheres, we welcome you to Buenos Aires, La Reina de Plata, a vibrant place to interact, exchange ideas, and socialize. And again, we have, Andrea and I, we have our list of thank you, the support from the former WISC president, as well as Pinar, our current president, Roberto Dominguez, Karina, our treasurer, as well as the hard work. We had two committees here, the International Committee, that include me, Erica, Anna, and especially Isaac, our IT wizard, as well as the local committee, including Ariel and Melissa, and again, Andrea and I as program chair. We extend our gratitude to the, I think that's the formal title in English, right? Pontifical Catholic University of Argentina, UCA, who bore with us for the past 3 years. You cannot take that for granted, right? And last but not least, and again, we have a long list. You can look at the program. People don't read, but you have look at the program. You'll find the list of about 40 and 50 people that they are section chairs, right? And from section, I mean, we had several sections from Maximiliano Villasoana. I start with Maximiliano, and last but not least, Melissa, who ran the team section. To all of them and to you, our dear participants, muchas gracias, bienvenidas y bienvenidos. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari. The next intervention will be made by Melissa Di Sancio from Flax Argentina.
Okay. With the voice I have, I'm going to be very short. I thought I was going to speak in Spanish, but I don't know why I ended up speaking English. And I don't think I can do what you did, so I will try. There's not much I can add. I think we are all aware that we are in a convoluted world with a lot of changes, economic, political. The pandemic has changed a lot of things, and the way we also interact and behave, and also we don't know where we're going. And I think that's something that is also a mark of these times. So I think this conference, the fact that we ended up having it after 3 years, actually give us the great opportunity to, in person and in a hybrid way, discuss, or at least try to find an answer to this where we are going. So one thing that I wanted to say, besides my great thank you to include me in this team, to have been part of this team, work with you, also with the whole WISC team, with Ariel. I think for Flaxo and for us to be part of another big international conference is always a pleasure, and it's also something that we are really engaged with and that we will try to keep doing, because one of the things that Pinar said, that if you want to know what international is, let's organize this kind of international conferences. But one thing that I want to bring regarding this conference is the importance to have it in the Global South, and the importance to have it in Latin America and in Argentina. Why? Because I think this is one more step into building a big community that it's been growing, I will say steadily in the last years, and that we can see that materialize not only in these kind of conferences, but also in the different networks that have been built around the region, along the region, the collaboration between academics in different countries, and also the exchange we have in academic terms. I think that's something that is quite, I'm not going to say it's new, but I think it's something that it has been growing, and we can see it also in the production, in the amount of books in the amount of journals, in the amount of also meetings and workshops and different spaces where we can still discuss IR, but not only discussing IR within the Latin American academic community, but also in these kind of spaces where we can engage and discuss with the international IR community. And for Latin American scholars, it's not always easy to go to international conferences. We all know that, and I'm being obvious with this, but being able to have the international conference to come to Latin America and have also the opportunity of this hybrid format, I think is also a really good thing, because we are able to discuss with people that maybe they wouldn't be able to come to Argentina or to another conference. So this, I think, is a great opportunity for the Latin American IR community, and of course for the Argentinian IR community. So in this sense, I think that the discussion in the conference will be really rich, and we can take a lot of advantage of this opportunity. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for everything, to UCA, to WISC, and also for the colleagues in Flaxo that also supported my work, because for me to be here and to be working and dedicating time to these conferences, because there is a lot of people that is working with me and also doing what I'm not doing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Melissa, for underlining the relevance of having an international conference here in Latin America, in Buenos Aires. Finally, we'll have the representative from the University of San Andres and Program Committee Chair, Dr. Andrea Wessner.
Thank you. I'm going to be very, very brief. I'm just going to say that it's been an absolute pleasure to work with the best local team. You two there, yeah, best local team, the best international team here and over here. It's been a lot of hard work. It's been true cooperation. It's been true cooperation between our local universities, UCA, Flaxo, UDESA, Universidad de San Andrés. It's been a true cooperation between the international universities too. The problem of being last is that everything that you had planned to say has been said already. Because I wanted to actually thank our own universities who allowed us to devote many, and I should get up and say many hours of our time to work for the conference instead of our other regular duties. So I think that big thank you we owe also to our own institutions. Other than that, I just wanted to remind everyone that the fun is still to come. We have a reception tonight, and on behalf of the University of San Andrés, thank you very much for being here and being part of this.
Thanks, Andrea, and I want to thank you, all of you, for your intervention at the opening ceremony. So we close this first stage of the formal opening session. So a final applause for everyone. Now we will move to the second stage of the conference opening, a roundtable discussion on Latin America and the Russian-Ukrainian war. I invite the chair of the session, Dr. Roberto Dominguez, as the speakers, Lemin Ruinsky, Andrea Wessner, and Monica Hertz to get on stage. Sí, 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 estaba conectado. Entonces, si la pudiese. Comentáselo en español. Sí, sí, podemos conectar. Long process. It's okay? Okay. In this very long process of organizing this conference 3 times, by the time we have the final version or what would be the final version of the program, the conflict in Ukraine broke out. And what we noticed is that actually we didn't have any panel program in the program in the final schedule of discussions, and we thought that it would be timely to have an opening conversation about the conflict in Ukraine, and as we are sitting in Buenos Aires and in Latin America, also how we observe, how we engage in that conflict. So that is the rationale of this panel, this opening roundtable. So what I suggested to make it quite agile and to open the conversation with the audience, I have suggested the volunteers that if you want to raise some questions, you will be handed a little paper. You have our volunteers there, and you can write your questions, and I will try to summarize the questions in order to have a very, very agile conversation. So, and in this regard, we have 4 stars, you know, very well-known scholars in the field of international relations, very well-known within our community and beyond our community of international relations. I want to extend the apology of Andres Servin, whose family went through a last-minute health challenge, and he apologized today. He's not even able to connect via online, and our solidarity to Andres Servin. So, and we have here on my left, we have Andrea Olsner from University of San Andres. We have our local organizer, Ariel González Lavalle from UCA. We have from Colombia, from ICESI, our good friend, Vladimir Rubinsky. And we have from Geneva, Monica Hertz, that is very well-known scholar in Latin America, and that is based in Pontifical University of Rio de Janeiro, but now she's connecting to this conference from Geneva. So welcome, Monica, and thank you for joining us at this time that it must be close to midnight, I assume, over there. So, okay, so what I suggested to the panel in order to let the ideas flow, I suggested to have a very brief opening remarks, you know, maybe between 5-7 minutes about the general topic that is
calling for this conversation today, that is about the Latin American and the Russian-Ukrainian war. And I suggested 3 general questions, and you feel free to somehow to respond or to go into your own remarks in order to spark the conversation with the audience. So the first step, and actually I was inspired by the words of the rector Schiavone, so that somehow mentioned something that is in the spirit of this panel, which is what did we learn from the past 2 years? That somehow we should have developed this empathy and developed this sense of vulnerability, and it seems that it's gone somehow. And I pose it as perhaps with question mark, you know. So in that regard, based on what the thoughts that were put on this table in the previous panel, to what extent, I mean, in this social contract that we are facing today, it came as a surprise the conflict in the invasion of Russia to Ukraine. You know, have we learned something about how to avert war, and have we learned something about how to prevent conflict? So I put this as a general spirit, and I will go to the 3 elements that perhaps we put on the table to open the conversation. So in that regard, one of the overarching elements in this conflict is related to the end of the Cold War, and to what extent 3 decades later, to what extent this is a relic. Perhaps we live in an illusion of the liberal moment. Perhaps we live in a moment that was quite volatile regarding globalization. So where do we stand? And I pose this as a question to that regard. Where do we stand today in light of the conflict? You know, or to what extent that conflicts we saw it coming, you know, on the other hand. So this will be the first set of questions. The second one is, what is the behavior of the main actors in the conflict? Are they really engaging in the way that will de-escalate the conflict, or they are exacerbating the conflict, or they are neglecting the participation, or still, as it was mentioned in the panel before, we haven't developed that sense of empathy in an international social contract of the 21st century, and maybe we are thinking still in the rational of the 19th century. So what is the role of Germany, the role of NATO, the role of Russia, Ukraine, the Baltic countries? So, and the third one, how do we see this conflict from Latin America, from the role of the governments, from public opinion? So I pose these 3 elements, and feel free to move in any direction you consider more pertinent, just as a way to spark the conversation. So, and with this, I will follow the order that was posted in the program, and for 5-7 minutes, and please submit your questions and to open the conversation in the last 30 minutes of this panel. So, Vladimir Rubinsky, would you like to open?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about the topic, which is, as you will understand, as I will be speaking, is quite sensitive for me. Late in the evening, February 23, I was awakened by a phone call. And it was from France 24 Spanish edition, who kindly informed me that Russian troops just crossed the border to Ukraine. And they asked me to go on air and comment on the development of the developing events. And the following 4.5 hours I spent talking about the war, which I, like many of my colleagues, was hoping would never happen. And still there I was, watching the terrifying live footage from Europe and talking about the war. In many senses, for me, this war is very personal. It is personal because I have friends and relatives on both sides of the front line, and because being a holder of a Russian passport, I'm ashamed of the actions taken in the name of my country, which includes atrocity committed against the civil population, shamelessly lying public officials, and the showcase of the way of thinking that I thought Russia had left a long time ago in the past. But being a political scientist and internationalist, I have to think of the evolving scenario as someone as Roberto was saying, who is interested in understanding better the fundamental causes of war and how to avoid further escalation of hostilities. To attempt to answer precisely one of the questions that you ask us, what went wrong? And this is by no means an easy task, since we have a great variety of explanations and approaches in our discipline that is known to favor multiple voices and consider pluralism of opinions as one of the most important values. In other words, it would be wrong to claim that there is only one explanation regarding the answer in the question, what went wrong? There are many. In this sense, from my perspective, the war on Ukraine is the result of many developments. However, there is one common denominator to most of them. It is the perception, from my perspective, held by many decision makers that the growing tensions between the established, emerging, and re-emergent actors could be resolved by simply adjusting the existing rules of the game. Yes, the post-Cold War world order, which served the purposes of the key actors ideally in international arena during between 20 to 25 years, proved incapable of coping with the ever-growing number of issues in the recent years. And that is why the attempts to prevent the war, using the recipes of the past, turned out to be unsuccessful. After all, the United States announced that the war was coming long before February 24, and as we know now, intended to convince Vladimir Putin not to attack Ukraine already in June 2021, and yet Moscow went ahead with its plans. The other common denominator is what seems to be a great degree of confusion, both among decision makers and scholars, about how to stop the war, or at least avoid the further escalation. And here, from my perspective, it is important to remember that Russia is not the Soviet Union. Firstly, Moscow does not aspire to compete with the United States globally, as the USSR did during a good part of the last century. Russia of Vladimir Putin neither is willing to destine a similar amount of resources to the war, and global rivalry, as the USSR did, is not in the plans of Vladimir Putin, at least as far as we know. Vladimir Putin is not willing to spend up to 25% of the GDP on security and support satellite regimes around the world like USSR did. There is no ideology that Moscow wants to project globally as the USSR did. Russia loves capitalism and loves money. And yet Russia still possesses nuclear capacity capable to end the life on the planet as we know it. And Vladimir Putin does not hesitate to remind the rest of the world about Russia's nuclear armaments. But it seems the possession of nuclear arms is not helping Putin to achieve the aims of the war, at least those aims that had been publicly announced by the leader of Russia. The Ukrainian government did not fall, and it's unlikely that it will be fallen soon. No denazification of Ukraine had been achieved, perhaps because there was no Ukrainian Nazi government in the first place. And after several months of war, Ukraine's national identity has strengthened, and Europe's acceptance of Ukraine as part of the common European space is growing dramatically. The expansion of NATO, which was supposedly one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin started the war, is accelerated as we see it now, and those countries that were not thinking about joining NATO are now rushed to join the bloc. So is Putin losing the war? I think this is the wrong question to be asked. The war in Ukraine is most likely not about losing or winning. It is about the new emerging world order, which is shaped by many heterogeneous developments, and perhaps the war in Ukraine is just one of them. And differently from many past scenarios, there are many more actors around the world who will be part of the process of constructing new world order. And here I would like to talk about the third question that Roberto was asking us. What about Latin America? Yes, I think the Russian war in Ukraine surprised many decision makers in Latin America and the Caribbean. Shortly before the war began, perhaps you remember, the leaders of some South American nations, which we know well who they were, went to Russia and expressed their support of Putin's foreign policy. It happened just a few weeks before the war started. At the same time, Russia's first Prime Minister, Yuri Borisov, visited Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba just days before the war started and promised to broaden military cooperation with vital Russian allies in the Western Hemisphere. Therefore, in the context of the unfolding war in Ukraine, the leaders of many Latin American nations experiences difficulties finding a way to distance themselves from Russia, at least during the initial phase of the war. In contrast, while expressing their support to Putin, Caracas, Managua, and Havana had to be careful not to give the impression that the war in Ukraine may be extended speedily to the region, using their nations as Russia's gateway. On the other hand, traditional US allies in the region like Colombia used the crisis in Ukraine as an opportunity to reconfirm their commitment to the established world order and offer it unconditional approval of the US and European position about the conflict. And still, while Bogota's rhetoric was met by fury in Moscow and the Russian envoy to the United Nations used the presentation by the Colombian president to at the UN Security Council to attack Colombia directly, the Colombian government did not turn its words into action. Colombia continued to maintain diplomatic and trade relations with Russia, and there is an ambassador in Russia at this moment. Again, the above background, the lack of consensus among Latin Americans on the Russian war in Ukraine, on the one hand, one would say, benefited Moscow by offering the Kremlin an opportunity to claim that the United States and the Western powers failed to achieve the desired isolation of Russia in the international arena. Although recent revelations about atrocity committed by the Russian troops in Ukraine forced some undecisive Latin American governments to condemn Russia's modus operandi publicly, to date, no nation in the region has taken full-scale measures similar to those adopted by the US and European governments. The question is, but should they? Or should they stay away from the troubles that seemingly do not attack them directly and seemingly do not concern them directly? And I think there is no easy answer to this question. It is important to remember that times of uncertainty, however, bring not only challenges, but also opportunities. And perhaps we can talk about this during this conversation. And this might be precisely this type of an opportunity for Latin America, in the sense that Latin America now can take advantage of new trends that we live in this region and actually try to become not a passive, but a decisive actors in the constructing of this new world order. Thank you very much.
Give the floor to Andrea Olsen.
A few minutes ago, rather briefly, I would try to highlight 3 points. I would perhaps pose them in terms of continuities and changes, and what we can see in terms of continuities and changes brought about by this conflict along 3 dimensions. In this context, the first dimension that I would like to highlight is, of course, the military and geopolitical dimension. And this is, here we have a continuation where we, perhaps for a brief period, we thought that there was change. We are seeing again a very traditional war with 2 or more, but traditional armies, traditional soldiers, bombs, as we thought that the new conflicts were different, right? There's been written about the new wars, about the changes in the war, and we are seeing a very traditional conflict and a very traditional war, in the sense that many scholars in IR thought that this had been left behind. So this is a continuity. We are seeing also, perhaps in terms of change, we are seeing the return of Europe. It's not entirely clear yet in what form But we have seen, of course, with the war in Ukraine, the reawakening, perhaps I should say, the reawakening of NATO. Again, where we thought, or many had thought, that NATO was brain dead already. And this is actually, I think, Macron said that, you know, the brain death had declared for NATO. Well, it's come back to life. This is continuation where we thought that had been change. I think that in this very traditional dimension, we should also consider the role of China sitting in a very uncomfortable situation, and the role of many middle powers. Think of India, think of Brazil, think of Pakistan, think of South Africa, think of Israel, right? Where the West would like to say, and has said, the whole world is condemning Russia. Russia is alone. Well, perhaps it's not that alone. There are many middle powers which are sitting on the fence and are not wholeheartedly embracing the Russian cause and Russia, but are definitely not siding with the West. So we are witnessing a world that is highly divided. So that's the first dimension, a geopolitical, military, very traditional dimension of international relations. The second dimension, where I think that we can see change, is the role of energy in this crisis. This is a war that happens in the context of an energy transition. There was a transition towards cleaner energy, and the war has actually produced an energy crisis. The energy crisis could have done two things, could have accelerated the energy transition, but it doesn't seem, perhaps it's too early to say, but it doesn't seem that it is accelerating the energy transition. Rather, it seems that it is accelerating a return, what's the word that I'm looking for? Going back, basically, sorry, I have written it here, a reversion, and instead of an acceleration of the energy transition, we see an exacerbation of the energy crisis. So that's the second dimension that I wanted to highlight of this conflict. And the third dimension that I want to highlight, and it's of course closely related to, or that sits in between the second and the third, I should say, sorry. So basically the reversion of the energy crisis has a very important impact on the environmental crisis. And now when we take the environmental crisis, when we take the geopolitical traditional agenda and the energy crisis, this has an important impact on the third dimension, which is the food crisis. The next thing that we are going to see here, and that we are seeing here, is an immense food crisis. Food crisis that we know that in many parts of the world, not just in Africa and Northern Africa in particular, in the Middle East, but also in Latin America, brings serious political instability. So the food crisis and the famines that the World Food Organization, it's not the World Food Organization. Yeah, it's the World Food Organization are already, yeah, is it? Yeah, they are already warning us about, is very closely related to energy and to environment, and of course to the traditional military agenda. I think that we are seeing here, and with this I'm going to end, something that it's not entirely new, but we are seeing it in a greater degree, perhaps, than in previous cases, is the weaponization of energy. So energy used as a weapon, and the weaponization of food as concrete strategies and very, very palpable strategies of conflict. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I guess that the inquiries or the points to spark the debate are piling up, and I guess we'll have a very interesting conversation after these opening remarks. So now the turn is for Ariel González Lavalle, following the order in the program.
Thank you, Roberto. It's a pleasure to discuss about this very interesting topic, especially about how the Russian-Ukrainian conflict is affecting Latin America. Well, first, have it turning from a roughly cooperative to a competitive setting in the last decade. If we review the literature 10 years ago, there was a lot about emerging powers. There was a lot about discussions on global governance, G20, different Gs. But nowadays, there is a swift change. This is something that is not new. So even if this conflict came for a big surprise for many expert analysts and scholars, the trends, especially in international security affairs, was, well, at least very clear, especially after some landmarks, for example, the Crimea annexation by the Russian Federation, or the post-Arab Spring situation in several Middle Eastern countries like Libya and Syria that still are suffering from civil wars and internationalized wars that basically end up in destroying their statehood. So a narrative about the return of the great power competition and the relevance of geopolitics have been gaining ground, and not only in the West, and not only after the 24th July. It's also gaining ground in Eurasian capitals, in Beijing, in New Delhi, in Moscow. And this is something that is not only reflected in the national security and foreign policy official documents, but also has been transmitted through the literature, especially in area studies. So the Russian invasion basically reinforced a general perception among experts and scholars that we are entering into a new stage of international affairs in which, again, high politics is moving at the center of the international agenda, something that we forgot for a few decades, especially after the end of the Cold War. So the international order drastically changed after the military Russia intervention. After years of rising tensions between Moscow and the West, Eastern Europe basically is facing a zero-sum scenario, which resembles the Cold War years. And actually, there have been discussions about the existence of a regional Cold War in the Black Sea, in Eastern Europe, since the 2014 Ukrainian crisis. But we are now in a completely different scenario in which these discussions have even more ground. Well, the European Union faces an armed conflict in Eastern European neighborhoods. This invasion is also becoming a dangerous case for a proxy war between NATO and Moscow. And in global affairs, we witness a lot of this kind of proxy wars, especially in the Middle East, Yemen, Libya, Syria, where great powers, regional powers, middle in very complicated and unsolved conflicts until now. So since the 24th February, there have been an acceleration of geopolitical and geoeconomic dynamics. The Western batteries of sanctions against Russia, to the spike in commodity prices and reshuffling of global supply routes presents several challenges for a still peripheral region like Latin America. The West right now generally perceives Russia as a challenging and fully revisionist power due to the confrontation, direct confrontation, and the use repeated of coercive powers against minor countries like Ukraine or Georgia. But still, Moscow had a leading role in Eurasia, major military capabilities, especially in the nuclear and ballistic area, and a role of destabilizer in the international security agenda. But this perception is not shared in Latin America at all. Basically, the Latin American elite sees, even if there are different perceptions, but in general, Latin American elites look at this conflict with something that is distant, that is far away, but still there are a lot of concerns about the direct and indirect impacts in the region. So the Latin American region is facing an order marked by competition between great powers, basically focused on the US-China dynamics, but still the region is trying to recover from the crisis, the pandemic crisis, and shows high levels of fragmentation. From a Russian perspective, Latin America can play an autonomous role in an increasingly multipolar, post-hegemonic, post-American order, while Moscow perceives itself as a great power in a polycentric world. So what Russia is not still a noble partner in Latin America, as Vladimir argues. Moscow developed an important foothold in the region from a wide range of high-level visits, especially after a crisis in the post-Soviet space, for example, after the Georgian conflict in 2008, or after the Crimea crisis, Crimean annexation in 2014. That generally involves military cooperation, especially with Venezuela, and renew ties with all partners from the Cold War, like Cuba and Nicaragua. In addition to the development of novel tools of soft power, basically based on the development of news service and state-sponsored media networks. But after facing this conflict, Latin America neither backs the Western sanctions on Russia, but no support the initiative to isolate Russia at all, especially from multilateral fora. The example is the next G20 meeting, in which Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico shares a common position not to cancel, not to block the participation of Russia. For the biggest Latin American economies, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, the war was something to condemn, but not their ties with Moscow. So in line with them, the region generally condemned the invasion in multilateral forums, from the United Nations General Assembly to the Organization of American States. But even if the economic and political ties were not affected directly, even in the case of Brazil, for example, the trade jumped more than 40%. Since the Western and Russian relations continue to downward, it continues to be in a downward slope, the relation between Latin America and Moscow will bear additional costs, which hinder regional autonomy in international affairs. So right now there is a very interesting discussion about the idea of to build a kind of new regional strategy for Latin America around the concept of active non-alignment. This is a case not of a rationalized non-alignment, but I think this is a kind of a non-alignment by by need more than a choice. So thank you, and I will be very glad to discuss these issues with the colleagues.
Okay. Extend our appreciation again to Monica Hertz from Geneva, who will join us now to share her views about this general topic.
Thank you so much, and I'm very, can you hear me? Yeah? Thank you so much, and I'm very sorry not to be with you in Buenos Aires at this point. Congratulations for this amazing meeting. I would like to start by expressing my solidarity with the Ukrainian people that have been, in spite of anything we may want to explain, the victims of a terrible aggression. I think that I'll try not to repeat what you already said, because there has already been so much input. But the point I wanted to make is that Latin America, as you have already said, has opted for very, very different positions regarding this conflict. What we see in terms of the pattern of behavior of the region is disparity. You see countries like Cuba and Nicaragua and Venezuela clearly supporting the Russian position, with emphasis for Nicaragua's position. The countries such as Chile and Colombia clearly criticizing and voting with the West in wherever it was possible. And at the same time, you have countries such as Brazil and Mexico with a more ambiguous position. And of course, Brazil calls everybody's attention in terms of opting for what has been termed by the government a neutral position on this war. I'm not going to get into the details of the Bolsonaro foreign policy, though if you want in the discussion, we can go back to that. But as a far-right government, it actually stands in a delicate position, not only because Brazil needs Russian fertilizers, but because the far-right globally, but not only in Brazil, is sort of divided between these two actors, because of course, Putin as an authoritarian conservative leader deserves some sort of praise and exerts attraction, but at the same time, Ukraine is a Christian white country that is being supported by the West, so it's not easy for the far right that understands this conflict as every other conflict in racialized manner to position itself. And in effect, the group closer to the president in Brazil did dispute this position. It wasn't such an easy position to reach. But in terms of this pattern of countries in the region opting for different positions, I would point out to three elements that I think we should look at to explain this disparity. I do understand that all the countries remain in diplomatic and economic relations with Russia, but still the positions have been quite different in terms of their discourse, in terms of how they voted. And I think this is important. Of course, the first explanation, the most obvious explanation, is the fact that Russian foreign policy for the region during the last 10 years, and I'm not going to talk about this because Vladimir obviously has written and studied the subject, and I have read him in order to understand the subject. So what we see is a very significant investment, not only in economic, but also in soft power terms in the region that, of course, has an impact in this decision-making process. So we have a kind of return of Russia to the region that is relevant, of course, has different relevance for different countries. Second, I would point out to the state of regional relations, the fact that we are in a moment of complete destruction and decadence of cooperative mechanisms in the region for several reasons. Of course, partly because of the lack of involvement of Brazil. And this it puts the country in a position where, puts the region in a position where there are no forums where there could be articulated some sort of common vision where negotiations regarding this could have taken place. The only forum that manifested itself in this regard was the OAS that suspended Russia and also issued a resolution condemning Russia. The third element that I would like to bring to our discussion that is perhaps more related to the discussion on the international order and the relation between this conflict and the transition to some sort of new order that many of you talked about, relates to the manner in which the Biden administration chose to frame this conflict, and followed by the countries in Europe and some countries also in the East. I think it was a mistake to frame it in the manner that they did frame it. I think in a situation in which we find ourselves now, where most of the world is not democratic, where liberal democracy is not does not prevail in the sense that some leaders thought it would prevail in the 1990s. What we see is quite the contrary. In many countries, the rise of authoritarian leaders and governments, the rise of conservatism, the rise of far-right groups in many, many countries, including Latin America. Perhaps the framing should have been, should have taken a step back and should have focused on the invasion, on the disrespect for territorial integrity, on these more basic norms that are more universal, that can be more universally accepted. And you do see in the manner that Latin American countries talked, leaders of Latin American countries talk, domestically and internationally, the framing in terms of this was wrong because it was an aggression, because it was a disrespect for territorial sovereignty. It was a disrespect for the basic rule that you do not change borders through aggression. On the contrary, the American framing of the war was in terms of a fight for democracy, a fight for civilization, a fight for a very broad project of life. And of course, the Ukrainian government framed it in this manner as well. Please do understand, I know there is a fight for democracy, and I know that the Ukrainian revolution that moved Ukraine towards a democratic system was unacceptable to the Russian leadership. the way they treat what they call the colored revolutions is very much within this context of a fight between an authoritarian image of the world and of social relations and a democratic image of the world. I think this fight does exist. It's very important. Actually, in my country, we are at the height of this fight. But in international relations forums, in terms of dealing with our level of interdependence, we have to find agendas that are possible, agendas that are acceptable to a much wider group of countries. And framing this war in terms of a civilizational war, which is partly a result of a transition that took place within NATO after the 2000s. This whole discussion about a fight for a model of life, a civilization that is more progressive, that is superior, and that is to be guided by the West is not acceptable. And the coalition that is possible within that framework is very limited. If you look at the population today of the countries that are sanctioning Russia and the population of the countries that are not sanctioning Russia, you see that Russia's isolation is quite limited in terms of the globe, thought in terms of humanity. Of course, if you look at economic power, at the capacity to move the global economy, it's a different thing. So I think that these three elements, and I stress the last because the other two had been mentioned, explain the fact that Latin America was not able to move as a region in any format, was not able to put its own agency on the table for the debate on this war and what this war means for international order. Thank you.
To the all speakers for the opening remarks. We have around 10 questions that I have grouped in three main areas that I guess they are interconnected. So I open the questions and feel free to pick up on the one that you consider that you would like to expand. Regarding the, and I will start with something that Monica Hertz mentioned at the end, related to the framing of the conflict from the United States, the perspective, you know. So what entails the universal, what is universally accepted, you know. Democracy is quite controversial because there are great trade partners that are not really democratic, but territorial integrity is almost a universal consensus. So in that regard, there's a question, there are a couple of questions that are related to that global order. One is related to the now what we used to say the elephant in the room, the United States. Now the other elephant in the room is China. You know, and to what extent in terms of order, you may name it a multipolar, multicentric, polycentric, to what extent this conflict is the starting point of something that has been somehow boiling for several years, and this is just the formal turning point in something that we saw coming, you know, that is basically China taking opportunity of this conflict in order to change or consolidate the international order. And related to this, there's a question that somehow raised something that Monica mentioned, you know, the framing of the conflict. I mean, the regime change that at some point the Biden administration mentioned that he had to step back. You know, so to what extent in that framing regime change is something acceptable within this conflict in Russia, you know? And what is the role of domestic politics? So this is the first set of questions related to order. There are other questions that are more economic oriented. And from that angle, basically it's about the cost and benefits for Latin America regarding markets. As you know, when there is a crisis in certain area, some emerging countries or some alternative markets can take advantage of those markets. So to what extent Latin America, in the calculation of some of the leaders, they say, well, we have a cereal or oilseed crisis, we can see this as an opportunity. As it happened in World War II with many Latin American countries. So to what extent this could prevent a more active role in Latin America in ameliorating the conflict and rather seeing this as an opportunity and remain silent, regarding what is happening in this conflict. And the prices of commodities. And I related to this question, what would be the rationale of Latin America? It's an economic one in taking that opportunity, or is more an ideological one? Okay, this is the second set of questions. And related to this, we shouldn't forget what was on the news today. The last question, economic oriented, is that Russia is defaulting the debt. So to what extent, and rephrasing what Vladimir said, perhaps the wrong question is who's winning or who's losing. I would say, well, but there are costs. What has been the cost? Is it worth? Sometimes costs are not necessarily something economic. It had to be related to identity. So it is the economic cost worth of waging this war. And finally, the third question is related to something that perhaps is not that visible. That is the case, to what extent will exacerbate the different deals in drug markets, in traffic of weapons, human trafficking, that somehow this open opportunity, and there has been on the news several events that sound a little bit suspicious about perhaps trafficking of arms around the world. So to what extent we will see with this conflict the spark in illegal traffic or arms. So these are the three, all the questions that I tried to group in these three areas. They are so many questions, but somehow group in three different areas. So I open the floor. Should we follow the order, or someone wants to start?
Maybe Monica.
Monica, we don't want to keep you a long time, so
no, I'm fine, don't worry. Do you want me to start? Okay, should I start? I can't hear you. Should I start? Okay, I understand that you want me to speak, though I can't hear what you're saying. Do you hear me? Yeah? Okay. So I'll go on. So let me address the first set of questions on international order. And let me just make one point on weapons, which is something I'm very interested in. I think we have to really be monitoring the weapons that are being transferred to the Ukraine. I do think this is an issue. Of course, the conflict has generated enormous profits for companies that are involved in these transfers. And it is important to analyze how the weapon market is part of this discussion, how the dispute between Russia and the West appears in terms of the weapons being used. And it's not possible to get into the details, but there are important details here in terms of which weapons are being used, requested, not used. So this is part of the scene that we have to analyze. In terms of order, in terms of global governance, I think that we have, and in particularly in terms of the Chinese elephant in the room, I think that this talks to what I was saying before. It is crucial that we do not move into a new Cold War. I think that we will have to, and for Latin America, this is absolutely crucial because China has become so important in terms of our economic and social life. We have to find a way to live with these countries, even if we disagree with their system of government. Not only because of how global and interdependent our economies have become, but also because they have nuclear weapons. And I think the other elephant in the room is the nuclear aspect. And as I can't remember who mentioned this, but one of you did, Vladimir Putin has very clearly threatened to use nuclear weapons throughout this process. And as we know from the history of the Cold War, we cannot be sure that they will not be used, either nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction, particularly considering the kind of leadership that is in control in Russia today. This is an issue. We do have to negotiate with these actors, even with Russia. But with China in particular, it would be easier if we focus on the territorial integrity norm and others, not only that, the humanitarian law aspect, things with which we can talk to China about. We do not want to break these rules because we do not want to open a window for Taiwan to be next. So I think we have to really move back to strengthening the rules that are possible. Humanitarian international law, where Russia is disrespecting humanitarian international law. This is something that is an issue for both democratic and authoritarian countries. We all have signed the Geneva Conventions. This is something that the Chinese leadership says over and over again, and we have to hold them to account. And the more basic rules, Westphalian rules, if you want, that otherwise we are throwing Russia and China into a hug, and that is not what we want. Thank you.
A reception as we will conclude this panel. So this is a way to keep you engaged to this conversation. And now the turn, who wants to continue?
Reverse order?
You want, yeah?
No,
reverse. Do you want to continue? Okay.
Yeah, I will be very brief. I will bring a concept developed by Richard Sagwa, an expert on Russian affairs. He talks about the notion of Atlantism, the increasing interdependence between democratic norms, economic ties, security commitments, especially in Eastern Europe, and especially related to the expansion of Western institutions, both economically, the European Union, and related to security affairs, the NATO. So this is an open question, no? Is a regional or even a global order based on Atlantism a stable one? That's Atlantism brings also high chances to promote changes in autocratic states, especially in the post-Soviet space. Is this a stable or forecast unstable regional order? But at the same time, is an unstable regional order based on territorial revisionism, like what Russia is proposing? Well, I think the answer is that's neither the Atlantism approach nor the Russian revisionism makes the world, the Eastern Europe more stable. So we have a clash of different approaches toward regional stability, regional order, and in this sense, I think that this hasn't been good news for the last 2 decades, and I think it forecasts that in the future there won't be such good news about regional stability, and maybe this Russian-Ukrainian war is just another chapter of a clash of visions between the West and Russia.
Okay, thank you. Andrea.
I'd like to say something. I think that the sanctions was one of the topics, right? Yes. So I want to say something about sanctions. I think that this war, if it does anything, is to highlight everything that, everything that the research on sanctions has already told us in the past. For example, that sanctions alone are not effective. And we see that sanctions alone are not effective. Of course, it's not only sanctions that are being put in practice here, but also we've heard the transfer of weapons, the training of soldiers, and many other things. We see as well, we don't get many news from Russia, but the little we know is that sanctions harm the people very often more than the leaders, and that's a problem too. And that's one of the causes why sanctions are usually not very effective. And the other thing that the literature also has told us for a long time is that sanctions are also very expensive, or rather costly, I should say, are very costly for the actor issuing the sanctions. And this is what we see in Europe too. The sanctions on oil and especially gas on Russia are very costly, would be very costly. And that's the reason why many European countries are so hesitant to actually impose a full package of sanctions. The only other thing that I would like to add regarding whether this is an opportunity perhaps, or whether this will be an opportunity for Latin America, is rather intuitively and with very little capacity on my behalf to give reasons. I don't think that this is an opportunity for anybody. I think that this war is going to be very costly for everyone. Now ask me to justify that, and I'm not sure I can, but intuitively I just say there are going to be no winners from this war.
Thank you. Finally, Vladimir.
Thank you very much for arranging the questions, and I think most of the questions have been answered. But there is one thing which I believe is still pending, and we haven't talked about what is the nature of Russia's interest to Latin America. And that's something that I would like to talk about because it may give us a clue what will be the future of Russia's relations with Latin America, which can be actually shaped by both Russia and Latin America and both elephants that you mentioned, which is the United States and China. And talking about China before going back to Latin America, of course, the outcome of the war will depend greatly on the position of China, because as I see it, at least in the beginning, Vladimir Putin was counted heavily on China's support in this adventure that he took, he's still taking in Ukraine. And China's position will be, without doubt, a decisive one in terms of creating some kind of new arrangement after the war one day will be over in Ukraine. Now, when it comes to Latin America, from my point of view, the key driving force behind Russia's engagement of Latin America has been what I call symbolic reciprocity, a strategy of Russia. Once again, Russia is not the Soviet Union. Russia is not prepared and never thought of trying to replicate the Soviet idea of bipolar world order, because Putin, after all, is very well aware, and we're talking about the cost of war, that one of the reasons of the Soviet collapse, there were, of course, several reasons, but one of the reasons behind the Soviet collapse was the fact that the Soviet Union was spending too much money on the terms of military security and supporting satellite states around the world. So Putin never wanted to repeat this. And the idea of Russia here in Latin America is to reciprocate what they are considered, what Russia considered aggressive actions, unfriendly actions by the United States and the West, in what Russian calls the area of near abroad, the territories of the former Soviet Union. And then once again, another topic that came up about the universality of the territorial integrity. I think Putin effectively ended this universality, but by actually, first of all, denying Ukraine the right to exist as a sovereign state, and now moving towards actually canceling the recognition of at least some of the Baltic republics' sovereignty. And yes, you are right, China is also looking at this direction, and this is very important, that Taiwan issue cannot be played out of what is happening now. So talking about the symbolic reciprocity, Russia look at Latin America as the United States near abroad. So they equate what they believe is the priority area of Russia's interest, the former territories of the Soviet Union, with what Latin America perhaps used to be to a certain extent, even though to say it's like it used to be 100% also would be an exaggeration, but used to be for the United States. And here, of course, many of my colleagues are telling me that the United States no more view Latin America in the same way as it did during the Cold War. But it doesn't matter to Russians, because Russian elites still play in this kind of categories that Latin America is the US near abroad. So what they want to do here is actually to try to reciprocate, and mostly symbolically, once again, because Russia does not want to spend tangible resources, and they have a great limitation of tangible resources, and this kind of stuff is quite expensive. So what they want is they want to show that in principle, they have the capacity to reach out such distant areas as the US near abroad, which is Latin America. And for that sense, they need Latin America. They need to maintain even limited kind of context in different areas, but to be able to show, to continue that they're capable of do this kind of reciprocity actions. And it is important to differentiate between the symbolic reciprocity and actually kind of building up a military presence that sometimes one can hear from some of the decision makers in the United States, some other places, but it still remains symbolic in nature. And this is, I think, the way how Russia will be dealing with Latin America in the future. Thank you.
Well, as we conclude the first formal day of activities, actually the second one, if we consider the workshops that we held yesterday, I want to thank all the local organizers. I want to thank Roberto, Liliana, Marcelo, Diego, and a group of volunteers, Paloma, who have been quite helpful. As you know, organizing a conference of this sort in this hybrid model demands a rapid response in many different ways. And I guess we couldn't do it without the group of volunteers that have helped us, and the generosity of the Catholic University of Argentina. And as we conclude the first day of activities, I want to thank the panelists. And if you want to continue this conversation regarding Russia and Latin America, Victor Jeffitz and Vladimir Rubinsky are presenting a book tomorrow in our conference, and as well, Ariel Gonzalez is presenting another book. So I call for your interest if you want to join us tomorrow to these two book presentations. I want to thank all the panelists, and now, without any further ado, I guess it is time to share a glass of wine. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Roberto, por su excelente moderación.
Muy bien,
Gracias.
Y sí, ¿no? Es muy sensible para ti, ¿no?
Es muy sensible, sigue siendo muy sensible.
Lo que llamas con mucha elegancia